Thank you, Steve. Well, it's lovely to be back with my colleagues. The best people I ever talk to are physicians, because you don't have to go through the rigmarole of explaining mutations and genes and radiation and the like. And they understand it immediately, whereas with a lay audience, it's really quite a complex thing to describe the effects of nuclear power and nuclear war. And as you probably know, at the moment, there's what they call a renaissance in nuclear power, which is actually, I call a relapse, because the nuclear industry have had a great gift, and that is global warming. And somehow their minds have twisted it around to say, well, we're the answer. I mean, we are clean, green, and sustainable. 3 fallacious facts. And they have millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to spend with big full-page ads on National Public Radio, PBS, to say that, you know, our children need electricity and we need nuclear power and it produces no CO2. I wrote a book about this, and we haven't got a copy, but that's the cover. It's actually in colour, but it's called Nuclear Power is Not the Answer to Global Warming. The first chapter deals with the fact that the nuclear power industry is undergirded by huge industrial infrastructure. And I know that because I live in Australia. And 40% of the world's uranium is in Australia. And we're digging it up like there's no tomorrow, which there may not be. The politicians don't care if anyone talks about the medical implications of people living near uranium mines, the fact that 30 to 50% of uranium miners in the past have died of lung cancer because of the radon gas they inhale. That's called emotional. And you can't be emotional in Australia. You have to talk about money and business. And you can talk a bit about global warming, but don't ever talk about the medical implications of what they're doing. Well, when you mine uranium, and you have to mine millions of tons of soil to get enough uranium, the trucks are almost bigger than this room. The tyres are as large as this, you know, as high as this room. And huge amounts of fossil fuel are used to mine uranium. And then the uranium has to be crushed in big crushers. It's called milling, more CO2. And then the uranium is turned into yellow cake, which is then transported to Paducah, Kentucky, where, where it's enriched. Now, because there are 2 isotopes in uranium, 235 and 238. I don't have a blackboard, unfortunately, but 235 is only present in 0.7%. That's a fissionable isotope, and it must be increased to 3% for use in nuclear power. What's happening? You're going to get a blackboard?
Yeah, get some water.
Oh. And to enrich the uranium, they convert the uranium to uranium hexafluoride, which is a gas. It's very corrosive. It's a halogen, so it probably causes ozone depletion. And huge amounts of this gas are produced. And then they have a series of cascades of micropore filters, thank you, through which they force the gas. And there are thousands of them. I've been to an enrichment plant they used to use at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's like a mile of buildings with all these cascades going around. And the gas is forced through, so on one side stays the 238 because it's heavier, and on the other side you collect more 235, and as the cascades go, so the uranium becomes enriched. And that's actually what Iran is doing. There's a new method to do this with a centrifuge, but America doesn't have that. This is so energy consuming that America uses 2 1,500 megawatt coal-fired plants to produce the energy to enrich the uranium. Number one. Number two, there are hundreds of miles of pipes, literally, containing the uranium hexafluoride, and it's very hot thermally, so it must be cooled. So adjacent to those pipes are pipes containing CFC gas to cool it, a refrigerant. Now, we all know that CFC is banned under the Montreal Protocol because it destroys the ozone layer, and that's why we're seeing more and more basal cell carcinomas and squamous and melanomas. I've had a melanoma, especially in Australia, where the ozone's very thin. But the nuclear industry has been grandfathered out of the Montreal Protocol. 93% of the CFC 114 gas, which is the most common CFC gas, released in America, comes from that uranium enrichment plant. Now, not only does it destroy the ozone, it's 10 to 20,000 times more effective as a global warming gas than CO2. How did I find this out? I heard about it and I rang the EPA, and I talked to a very nice woman called Nancy Cheklik, and she sent me all the stuff. What you need to know is that we only know the tip of the iceberg of this whole nuclear fuel cycle. It's terribly complex. There's huge amounts of chemicals, including sulfur, all of which has to be created and manufactured. Then when they have enriched it, then of course they build the reactor. Now, I learned recently that making concrete is a very powerful source of CO2. They have to heat the calcium carbonate and they have to crush it and all sorts of things. And it's very CO2 productive. So you build this huge, monstrous thing, and then in 40 years you have to close it down because it's so radioactive that people can't go there anymore. And then you have to let it cool for maybe decades, I mean radioactively cool, and then they cut it apart by remote control using robots. More CO2. You have to store the waste. Every year they remove 30 tons of thermally hot, highly radioactive waste in the form of fuel rods, which are 1/2 inch thick and 12 feet long. So radioactive, if you stand next to one for a couple of seconds, you'll incur over 250 rems, which is the LD50 for radiation, where 50% die. Wow. So you die of acute radiation illness, you know, with the hair, alopecia and vomiting and diarrhea. So these are hot, they have to be continually cooled. So they put them in cooling pools with water circulating continuously. There's as much radiation in a reactor as 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Long-lived, not the short-lived isotopes, long-lived. 200 isotopes are made when you fission uranium. Some last seconds and some last millions of years. Radioactive iodine-129 has a half-life of 17 million years. Okay. So these rods have to be kept cool. In the cooling pools are 2 to 30 times more radiation than in the reactor itself. On many of your reactors, and you've got 103, the cooling pools are on the roof, sitting there, visible. And if you're a terrorist and you have a shoulder-held missile thing launcher, you can punch a hole in the cooling pool and out comes the water and you get a meltdown in a cooling pool. And there are people at Princeton who's done a study of a meltdown in a cooling pool, much, much, much more severe than a meltdown like Chernobyl in the reactor itself. No one has protected these cooling pools. There's virtually no security at the nuclear power plants. The guards work there 12 hours a day. They go to sleep on the job. The NRC has sort of exercises where they're going to try and get into the reactor like as if they're terrorists. They inform the utility 6 months before, and over 50% of the time the terrorists get in actually into the control room. So the whole thing is really a catastrophe waiting to happen. I said to a nuclear engineer the other day, what's the risk of a meltdown in America? And he said, off the bat, 1 in 10 in the next 10 years. Now, if that happened to be in Indian Point near New York, 35 miles from, and the wind was blowing towards Manhattan, in fact, the terrorists had targeted those 2 reactors. And they didn't go into them. They went into the World Trade Towers because they thought they were protected by missiles. And of course, there are no missiles. There's nothing to protect the reactors. So you melt down a reactor at Indian Point. That's the end of the financial capital of the world. Up to 1 million people would die, and I can't remember the exact figures. They're in my book. But hundreds of thousands would die immediately from acute radiation illness. And you know, it's near Westchester. And you can imagine people hearing the siren, getting in their cars, trying to get to their children at the daycare centre, trying to get to their spouse or the school, absolute gridlock on the roads. You shouldn't get out of your car because you'll breathe in more radioactive isotopes. And if you do get out of the car, there's a thing called ground shine, whereas the isotopes go on the ground, they emit huge amounts of gamma radiation. Then people in New York, there'll be an epidemic of leukemia like there was in Hiroshima 5 years later. Leukemia has a short latent period of carcinogenesis, and then 15 years later solid cancers of breast, lung, thyroid, you name it, start arising. Interestingly, in the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, new cancers are appearing of bone marrow, of the renal tract. So there's a different latent period for each cancer post-irradiation. So America's got these 103 reactors, many of them are old, and it's very expensive to build a reactor. It's much cheaper once the reactor is built, paid for by federal tax dollars. It's a socialised industry in a capitalist society, and they fought like mad for the health care because they said it was socialism. We've got free medical care in Australia. We've always had it, you know. I mean, you go to your GP, you get seen, you pay the money, and you go next door and the government gives you money back in your hand. That's called civilization. Anyway, where was I? Manhattan, people dying, Hibakusha. So, yeah, we learned about radiation from following the atomic bomb survivors. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission followed them and documented them and did tests, but they were never treated. They had no medical insurance, never treated by America. So they're a total guinea pig population from which we've learned how much to expose our patients to radiation. Of course, that data now is really out of date. And most of the radiation they got was gamma. And you can't extrapolate gamma, which is like X-rays, to internal emitters, which are alpha and beta radiation. Do you all understand what alpha radiation is? No, I didn't. I didn't learn it in medical school. Okay, so if you've got an alpha isotope emitter, it's particulate, and the unstable atom sends out 2 protons and 2 neutrons, and it's heavy, it doesn't travel far. So for instance, if you hold plutonium in the palm of your hand, which is an alpha emitter, the alpha particle doesn't penetrate the dead layers of dermis to damage, epidermis to damage living cells. But if you inhale the plutonium, the alpha particle goes a short distance, and most cells in that small volume that get irradiated die. But as radiation decreases with the square of the distance, so the cells on the periphery remain viable, they get mutated, and alpha radiation is about the most carcinogenic thing you can imagine. Plutonium is an alpha emitter. Each reactor makes 500 pounds of it a year. You need 10 pounds to make a bomb, a lump the size of a grapefruit, probably 10 to the minus 6, but 10 to the minus 9 grams is carcinogenic. Its half-life is 24,400 years. So you find the nuclear industry saying, oh, do you want a nice nuclear reactor? It's going to stop global warming, which is a lie. To Syria, to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia, to Libya, all over the place. They're going to sell these things. And they said, oh, we won't sell it to unstable governments, you know, who might be dictators and make bombs. But the stuff lasts for 500,000 years. It's so obvious, if you extrapolate into the future, that any country that has a reactor has a bomb factory and can make nuclear weapons for the rest of time. For the rest of time. And you know yourselves, I mean, look at America. You sometimes have stable, sensible presidents. And then you get a president with an IQ of about 100. And that was Reagan, because I met him in the White House and spent an hour and a quarter with him, really with a doctor-patient relationship, holding his hand most of the time because he didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. Nice old man. I came out and I said, I think he's got impending Alzheimer's, which he actually did. But then you got Bush, whose IQ was even lower. In quotes, the most advanced progressive country in the world. So, in other words, you can never predict how a country's going to go, and it's a bit scary now because you could get Sarah Palin as your president, who thinks, you know, that Russia's next door and she can see it from a window and, you know, no worries. So, well, we know as physicians that people are fallible. We ourselves make mistakes with our patients. You know, I once over-transfused a little girl. It was hot, I was on take, I had 32 patients to admit that day, and many were dehydrated, and she was, so I turned up the IV high, and I didn't write following notes, and at 3 in the morning the sister in the ward rang me, who wasn't very experienced, and the child was having seizures. And I stood at the end of the bed in my yellow flannel nightgown without my pants on, thinking if this child is mentally retarded or dies, I'll give up medicine, you know. Well, I had a good registrar and he gave her diuretics and stuff, and the next morning she's standing up playing in a cot. But what I'm saying is we all make mistakes, especially if we have a fight with our spouse or we've got the impending flu or whatever. And to try and imagine that people can be infallible, or that dictators won't rise, and you know you've had some sociopaths in charge of your country in the last few years, including Rumsfeld and Cheney. I mean, if there was ever a sociopath, it's Cheney. He built a big underground shelter after 9/11 at the vice presidential mansion, and all his neighbours heard this banging and crashing all night for years. He used to ride around in his car with a radiation suit and a gas mask. I mean, anyway, I won't go into his psychological background, but we all have psychological backgrounds and none of us are stable, let's be frank. You know, our emotions are engendered in our midbrain and we use our brilliant neocortex to rationalise what we really want to do. And that's what we usually do, right? So Obama, by embracing nuclear power, and I know he's cautious, but he took over $250,000 from the nuclear industry. One of his closest friends is John Rowe, who runs Exelon in Illinois, and they've got 11 reactors around Chicago. And John Holdren, his science advisor, is pro-nuclear. I know John, he's a fine man when it comes to disarmament, but he's out to lunch with nuclear. And then there's Stephen Chu, who comes from Los Alamos, or one of those nuclear weapons labs, and he's totally pro-nuclear. So Obama's been sort of seduced over into saying, and it's partly so he can get the Republicans on board, so they'll vote for a bill to prevent global warming. The whole thing's nuts. Now, from a medical perspective, although if you live near a reactor, you're at risk of getting cancer because they continually emit tritium. Well, they say there's nothing wrong with tritium, it's only radioactive hydrogen, yeah? Forms tritiated water, which is absorbed straight through the skin if you're in an inversion system and a fog. It's inhaled, it combines in the DNA molecule, it's a soft beta emitter. Beta is an electron emitted from an unstable atom. And it's also, as it's a soft beta emitter, all the radiation is absorbed in the surrounding tissue. It causes, and they've done lots of experiments with rats and stuff, cerebral tumours, fetal abnormalities, genetic abnormalities, and cancers in many organs. There's nothing that can prevent the escape of tritium except gold, because it's such a tiny particle and so active. It gets out of everything else. So when you run a reactor, it's continually being emitted into the air and into the cooling water. Reactors have 1 million gallons a minute of cooling water to keep them cool. Well, what about global warming? In France, several years ago, there was a big heat wave. The water in the rivers fell and it was hot. So there wasn't enough water, and the water was too hot to keep the reactors cool, so they shut them down. Many reactors are built at ocean level. As the oceans rise, which is a prediction, so the control rooms will drown and we'll have meltdowns. So global warming is antithetical to the safe operation of nuclear power, and anyway, there's no safe operation. So the industry, instead of building new reactors, is extending the lives of the reactors, because that's where you make the money, selling the electricity after the government and taxpayers have paid for building a reactor. So they are extending the life of the old reactors, which are all embrittled from neutron radiation, falling apart, cracking and stuff, another 20 years. And they're including more highly enriched uranium to pump up the power level, and the things are literally shaking themselves to bits. Now, if there is a meltdown, what do? Well, at 3 Mile Island, all the doctors fled and left the patients in the hospitals to care for themselves, because they knew. They took their children with them. So patients turn up in our hospitals all radioactive. Well, the government says you take them down to the mortuary and you hose them down with a hose. All the radiation goes into the sewage system. Well, that's okay. But the fact is, we'll be similarly dead or injured too. I mean, well, there's nothing we can do with people who are contaminated with internal emitters. I-131, strontium-90, cesium-137, plutonium, you name it. I've just been in Spain. 40% of the European landmass is radioactive from Chernobyl. I've got a map here, but you won't see it. But if you want to come up afterwards and see Europe, that's wrong. 40% of the land is still radioactive, and this is only a map showing cesium-137, which is a beta and a gamma emitter, half-life 30 years, it lasts for 600 years. There are still farms, over 300 farms in England, growing lambs, and the lambs are so full of cesium they can't be sold on the market. The fallout came down in hot spots with the rain. Don't ever buy Turkish food. There was a hell of a fallout in Turkey. But I went to my organic food shop and they had Turkish dried apricots. And I said, are these radioactive? And the man said, well, they're organic. I rang the man who tests the food coming in from Europe, the batches. I said, how do you test this? He said, oh, we do random spot checks, which means we miss a lot. And I said, what do you do when you find radioactive food? He said, oh, we dilute it with non-radioactive food. The solution to pollution by dilution when it comes to radiation is fallacious, as we all know, because it reconcentrates back in the body organs. So I don't buy European food. I only buy Australian food. I look really carefully to see where the tomatoes are grown and where the olive oil comes from, and we have some really good food in Australia. We have non-radioactive food, which we could sell to Europe and make a lot of money, but we don't, because we want to sell uranium so they can have the pleasures of radiation and children die. The German government just did a study of 16 reactors, looked at children under the age of 5K from the reactor. They had more than double the incidence of leukemia and a high incidence of cancer, and the closer you got to the reactor, the higher the incidence of malignancy. That's one of the really first decent epidemiological studies ever done around reactors. If you don't want to find out, don't do the study. And epidemiological studies are expensive, hard to do, take a long time. And who would fund it? Why would the federal government fund studies of people dying around reactors? But that's the least of it. The most important part is the radioactive waste. You've got 64,000 tonnes of this stuff sitting in the cooling pools, open to be attacked. What are you going to do with it? Well, they found a mountain in Nevada called Yucca Mountain, transected by 30 earthquake faults, including one called the Ghost Dance. And they dug big holes. It's made of pumice, you know, that very permeable stuff from volcanoes. It's sitting on a big aquifer that supplies Las Vegas. Anyway, because Harry Reid's from Nevada and because he helped Obama get elected, Obama's cancelled Yucca Mountain. It would have meant hundreds of shiploads of radioactive waste across your highways for the next 30 years, called the Mobile Chernobyl Bill. Because if you want to destroy Chicago, you just, you know, shoot a thing at one of the canisters going through, and the meltdown in the canister would damage much of Chicago. So it's an intractable problem. Well, it's not so intractable because in fact Cheney and Halliburton built a railway line that transects Australia. And next to the railway line are Aboriginal tribal lands. Well, who cares about Aborigines? You know, we called it terra nullis when we first went there and put the Union Jack there, because there are all these sort of strange people looking at us planting the flag. So we said they didn't really exist. And then we killed them, we poisoned their water holes, we did dreadful things. Dreadful things. And so now they've found this station called Muckaty Station. They've bribed the two tribal elders $12 million. All the rest of the tribe disagrees. Muckaty Station is right next to the Halliburton railway line. And our last Prime Minister, called John Howard, who was very bad, although I think our new Prime Minister is worse. Howard was a wolf in wolf's clothing, at least he was honest. This one's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Signed an agreement with George Bush called the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, which to say, we can export uranium, but we have to bring it all back when it's radioactive from the country so they won't build nuclear weapons. That's facile in itself. And then we'll reprocess it. We'll chop it apart by remote control, and we'll melt it in concentrated nitric acid. And from this reprocessing plant, we'll remove the plutonium, because that's good for bombs. But because we're running out of uranium, the world is, there's only enough uranium for 10 or 20 years left, okay? So it's not sustainable. You take out the plutonium, which is also fissionable, i.e. hydrogen bombs, right? And so you put 5 to 15 tons of plutonium in what they call a fast reactor or generation 4 reactor, and it's cooled by liquid sodium. Hands up those who remember their chemistry. Go on. Who knows about the properties of liquid sodium?
Sodium oxygen.
When exposed to air or water, it burns and explodes. So you get a hole in one of the cooling parts of liquid sodium. You lose your coolant, plutonium melts down, like Chernobyl, but plutonium, but as well as a meltdown and release of this stuff, you get a massive nuclear explosion, because 10 pounds is critical mass. You get 15 tons of plutonium reaching critical mass, and you probably could see this explosion from Mars. And that's their new reactor design. Notice I use a handkerchief to blow my nose and not a tree. That's the only thing that I was in Copenhagen that the countries agreed on universally was to grow more trees and leave the trees in place, because they're the lungs of the earth. They inhale CO2 and they produce oxygen. Anyway, so this will last me till I die if I don't lose it. Now I've lost my train of thought again. Oh yeah, breeder reactors. So then you scatter 15 tons of plutonium to the four winds. Can you imagine a more satanic machine? Can you imagine? And it's also great because if you surround the plutonium fissioning with a blanket of uranium-238, it captures neutrons and automatically turns into plutonium, and that's called breeders. So you get out more plutonium than you put in. And then you have an endless supply of electricity. Now, people who were in the Manhattan Project have been dreaming about this since 1945. And the nuclear industry calls it, well, we just burn the nuclear waste. They just take the plutonium, not all the other fissionable products like strontium and cesium last for 600 years, and I-129 that lasts 17 million years, and technetium 99 and carbon-14 that lasts for a hell of a long time. Just take the plutonium and you fission it and you burn it. Well, only less than 10% fissions. So it's all a lie. But do you think Mrs. Brown out there, I stand in this place and I look out there and see all the people who could be in all these apartments, do they know any of this? No. What did we teach them during the 80s? Well, we did teach them the medical effects of nuclear power, but we also taught them the medical effects of nuclear war. When I started in '78 founding PSR, virtually every American I spoke to said, well, it's better to be dead than red. I said, you want to be dead? Yeah, well, we don't want to be communists. And I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? And they said, well, yeah, they don't want to be communists either. So we started our symposia, doing a bombing run, dropping the bombs on Seattle and LA, and Richard and Pauline organised that wonderful symposia, and at Harvard, and we had all the guys from the Manhattan Project speaking and the like. And there'd be a map of Seattle the next day on the Seattle Post-Intelligence with the concentric circles of vaporization up to 5 miles and third-degree burns out to 20 miles and a huge firestorm of 3,000 square miles, and people would get up and look and say, oh, this isn't good for our health. And then the Catholic bishops started looking at it and they said, well, Jesus wouldn't think this was a good idea. So they had a pastoral letter against nuclear war, and then all sorts of other organisations started, like chiropractors and psychologists and businessmen and architects and historians saying nuclear was going to be bad for architecture. And then I was, or, you know, bad for history, it might destroy a bit of history. And then I was asked to speak at the annual Morticians Association. And I said, what do you want me to talk to you for? And they said, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself. Anyway, so I went along and I passed a resolution against nuclear war. So in 5 years, 80% of Americans changed from supporting the concept of nuclear war to being opposed. That was the second American Revolution. Peaceful, sagacious and Gandhian. And we led it. The doctors. Because why? Because we have absolute credibility. Don't we? Well, now we can't any longer stay in our labs and our consulting rooms waiting for patients to turn up with their cancer. We've got to practice preventive medicine, because this radioactive waste is going to leak, and it's leaking now in various places, underground water systems, bioconcentrate by orders of magnitude in the food chain. We will leave the legacy of epidemics of cancer, leukemia and genetic disease for the rest of time. Not just in humans, but all animals and plants. Random, compulsory genetic engineering. Forever. Now this is a medical health problem far more serious than smoking. Because we'll all be dead, and that's the legacy we leave. How immoral! How immoral! And the people who designed the bombs, they knew right back then how dangerous radiation was. We know. We irradiate our patients far too much with CT scans and fluoroscopies and God knows what. Last, the radiologists are starting to say, well, we have to work out the dose that you get when you have a CT scan. But often, you know, the doses aren't even calculated. And we know that radiation is cumulative, and we know that children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults because they're mitosing rapidly. So it's a huge moral problem. It's hard for people to extrapolate into the future, but they did with nuclear war, and we haven't had one, and everyone woke up. Now, the risk of nuclear war is the same as it was when the Cold War ended. Why? Because we had a president with no spinal column, and that was Clinton. Clinton smoked some dope, he didn't go to Vietnam, and he didn't know how to take on the Pentagon, and besides he had a psychological deficit because he needed to be loved. So instead of, and he had a very compliant man in the Kremlin called Yeltsin, who was a hardened alcoholic with Korsakoff syndrome and Wernicke's encephalopathy. He was very compliant. Clinton could have got an Air Force One, flown to Moscow and said, here Boris, sign here, we're going to abolish weapons in 5 years. He didn't do anything. So the weapons are left in place on hair trigger alert. Of all the weapons in the world, 26,000, Russia and America own 97% of them. Who are the real rogue states? What is really the axis of evil? These countries hold the world at nuclear ransom, and it could happen tonight. On 9/11, no one knew what was happening. They went from DEFCON 6 down to DEFCON 2. The guys in the missile silos got the keys out ready to turn them. Because the anxiety was so great, and the ignorance, and you know, we're all prone to that. You know, if we lose a member of our family or in an accident or something, you know, we go Burko. Well, we nearly had a nuclear war, and I can give you other instances of getting to within minutes of pressing the button. Obama will get 3 minutes. You know what the football is? Hands up those who know what the football is. Well, if you watch the president, always walking just behind him is a man with a suitcase. And that is the codes to start a nuclear war. Yeltsin once got to within 3 minutes of actually pressing the button when the football was opened. We live on the edge of catastrophe every single minute of every day. The early warning system's been triggered by a flock of geese, or the moon reflecting off the clouds when the satellites have picked it up and thought that Russia had launched, or vice versa. Now, Obama, bless his soul, and he was a young man in New York at Columbia when we had 1 million people in Central Park. Do you remember that in '82? That was what we did, all of us together. And he wrote 2 papers talking about how to produce total nuclear disarmament between Russia and America. I'm sure he was in Central Park. I got 3 minutes to talk, and I stood up and there was an ocean of faces, and I thought, what am I going to say? So I dropped the bomb on them. And that was quoted in the New York Times, so that was good. So he knows in his soul and his bone marrow what nuclear war means. So that's why he went to Prague and said he wants to abolish weapons. Now, he's up against the most powerful forces the world has ever seen, and that's the Pentagon. They spend $1 trillion of our money, I pay taxes here, on weapons and killing. Yet those people in the Congress kicked up such a hell of a fuss to provide free health care and keep people alive instead of killing them, and they never talk about the Pentagon, which is actually organised killing. And I'm sick of them killing. I want to write a book called Why Men Kill. I don't understand, but I want to write a book. The latest neurophysiology, the female brain, the male brain, Jungian psychology, God, Catholic Church. I mean, it's endless. Violence and killing, that's interesting, because violence and sex. There's new work done in the limbic system, and there are 2 emotions that trigger endorphins. One is violence and one is sex. Isn't that interesting? Why do they play men porno films in the aircraft carriers before they take off to bomb Iraq and kill people? What is this? I've met men who actually ejaculate when they go into battle. What is the connection between sex and violence? There is a connection, and it has to be examined. What does oxytocin mean? There's been a lot of new work done on oxytocin, the nurturing hormone. Perhaps we should give, I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to stop. Oh, I know, I worked out a new theory. And John Cleese once was on Monty Python as this female scientist, and he said, yes, I've got a new theory. He was being interviewed by the BBC, and they said, well, Dr. Brown, what is your new theory? And he said, it's mine, it's all mine, and I thought of it. So the BBC man said, well, Dr. Brown, we'd really like to hear what your theory is. I thought of it, and it's all mine. And then finally he said, a dinosaur's thin at one end, thick in the middle, and thin at the other, and that's my theory. Anyway, so when it comes to men, it's like that. At one end are lovely, loving men, and that's everyone in this audience, who would never hurt a fly, right? Then there are most of the men in the middle who will play video games which are vile, and they're all about killing. Vile. Who are these people producing these things for my grandchildren to play? How dare they? They'll go to war, but many come back terribly traumatised. And then there's the other end, a small minority of men whose reptilian midbrain has a toxic reaction to testosterone. And so I'm going to dedicate my book to Donald Rumsfeld. He's going to be on the frontispiece. But I think that's true. And they're sociopaths, I think. 1 in 25 people are sociopaths who have absolutely no moral conscience, never feel guilt. They're charming as hell. They're very intelligent. And they're also so neurotic and charming that they tend to rise to the top like cream and destroy people on the way. And I saw it at Harvard Medical School. The guys stabbing each other in the back, to be more powerful. So it happens in medicine, it happens at universities, it happens in corporations. They kill each other psychologically. So that's something else to be examined. So anyway, that's my theory. So now Obama said that he needs help. He cannot possibly do this alone. With those, well, I could swear, but Americans don't like swearing. You call it cursing. But in Australia we swear a lot. But anyway, those people at the Pentagon, I mean, we've got to get rid of these killers. And the military-industrial complex, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're making weapons currently to put into space, to fight war from space. I wrote another book here called, with someone else, where is it? Called War in Heaven. Read that if you want some, have nightmares. This is, and where's the money coming from? You. Why are the Americans so dopey? Why are they dopey? Anyway, we know, and we should be the leaders. So we've got to get out and close down all those reactors. I don't know what on earth anyone's going to do with the radioactive waste. Close the reactors down soon. We have to get Obama to stop talking about clean coal, because that's a myth. It's like the cure to cancer. And we have to get him to read this book, Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, which has looked at all available technology, and all your energy can be produced from solar, wind, hydro, tidal power, geothermal, cogeneration, and conservation. Americans can save 28% of electricity they currently waste. And think when we were children, well, I'm older than most of you now, I'm 71. We only just got electricity when I was a child, and all we did was turn on the lights. Oh, and we had a radio. Now if you go around your house at night, there are blinking lights everywhere. DVDs, televisions, computers, printers, ovens, refrigerators. That 6% of the electricity America uses comes from this wasted energy. We all have to walk around at night and turn everything off, turn it off. But also, we think we have an entitlement and a moral right to use electricity like this, as if we're going to die if we don't have our computers. I mean, you know, if we have a blackout, what's going to happen? We won't live. Mozart wrote by candlelight. Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. I'm not saying we need to go back to candles, but we need to get some perspective in where we're going. I mean, even you buy a carving knife now and it's electric. You don't even use your muscle. People use leaf blowers and they're ghastly. They pump out CO2, they smell and they're noisy, and they don't use their muscles. No wonder we're getting atrophy of our muscles. So conservation is key. So we have to close the reactors down. We have to teach the President and every single member of Congress about this. This is the roadmap for the future. There are other such studies, but this is a really good one. It's very complex. I read it in the bath and I felt like Archimedes, jumping out of the bath and running down the street naked, saying, my God, this is the answer. It's very exciting. And we've got to really help Obama with these nuclear weapons, and we've got to get out and talk about over 1 million people have been killed in Iraq for no reason. In Fallujah, the incidence of severe congenital anomalies has gone up 25 times. What, 25% or 25 times? No, 15 times, sorry. Women are too terrified to deliver their babies now. And the incidence of cancer's gone up nearly as much as that too, particularly in the children. Same in Basra. There are now articles appearing in the journals about this. I mean, that's depleted uranium. What are we doing? This is nuclear war. The uranium they use is 238, half-life 4.5 billion years. So what we're doing is conducting a nuclear war in the cradle of civilization, where arithmetic began, law began, you name it, writing, and leaving it forever contaminated. Those people are condemned forever. Now they're using it in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The drones are shooting out missiles with DU. Now it's important that we look after our individual patients, and we can become totally involved in that. But we've got to practice global preventive medicine, because the only people that will be listened to about this is us. And that's why we did medicine. That's why we took the Hippocratic Oath at this particular point in history. Anyway, thanks very much.